and welcome to Communication Theory, Doctor. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the narrative paradigm. Now, if you're new to communication theory, you might be thinking, what in the world is a narrative paradigm? So let me start off by defining those two words. First of all, a narrative or a narration can simply be defined as words or actions that give meaning to lived events. So, for example, a narrative might be your evening news broadcast and the story that the anchor is covering on the broadcast. It might be your coworker sitting in the break room at work telling you about something that happened to him over the weekend. Right? So a narrative is simply communication that gives meaning to events that we live or experience. A paradigm is a conceptual framework or model. And so this was originally proposed by a theorist by the name of Walter Fisher, who was for a long time before his death a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in their Annenberg Public Policy Center. And Fisher's narrative paradigm is based on the idea that man is a storytelling animal. That storytelling and narrative have been the key way, the chief way that human beings have communicated ever since human beings first walked the earth. And if you look at ancient traditions, how accounts, information, etc. were handed down verbally. Later on, of course, recording came into the picture. But from the dawn of human existence, narrative has been how men have communicated, women have communicated, human beings have communicated. And so it recognizes that narrative has been and continues to be the basis of all human communication. And Walter Fisher essentially proposed that the rational world paradigm that makes up so much thinking and so much of how people view the world, and he said, let's shift and look at that through the narrative paradigm, because narratives have been the way that human beings have communicated since the beginning. Let's try to understand it through a narrative paradigm instead of a rational world paradigm. And so, how do you do that? Well, Fisher recognized that not all stories are created equally. Just because someone tells a story doesn't mean that the story is to be believed, and doesn't mean that the story is credible in all of its details. And so he recognized this, and he said not all stories are equally good. There has to be a way that we can evaluate stories for their worth. And so he proposed, as part of the theory, what's called narrative rationality, which was a way to evaluate the worth of a particular story. And there's two components of narrative rationality. The first being narrative coherence. Now, narrative coherence deals with the internal consistency of a story. In other words, does the narrative hang together? And I think a good example of this would be if any of you watching have ever watched police interrogation videos. Maybe you're true crime fans, and you watch how police interrogate suspects. What they're looking for when they're getting a suspect story, part of what they're looking for when they're getting a suspect story, is they are looking for consistency. Does the person's narrative hang together? Do the internal details make sense with each other? Or are there all kinds of inconsistencies, discrepancies, etc. in the story that the person is telling? And so the police don't necessarily know it, but they are applying narrative coherence to the suspect's story, and they're evaluating it based on that idea. So narrative coherence. Now, the second component of narrative rationality is what's called narrative fidelity, and that's based on this question, and that's, does the story ring true and humane? In other words, does the story match up to, or is there congruence between the narrative and what people listening regard as truthful? So, in other words, thinking back to the police interrogation. Let's say that they're interrogating a possible suspect about a crime. So the suspect is going to tell their story, and the policeman listening is going to say, does this ring a bell with me? Does this match up with what I and what rational human beings would consider humane? Does it match up with what rational human beings would consider, normal human beings would consider to be true? Does it match up with their values? And so that is narrative fidelity. And so Walter Fisher, though he understood that and proposed that all human communication has narrative at its base, he also understood that narrative has to be evaluated. It has to be understood for fidelity, and it has to be understood for coherence. And that if you identify a narrative or a story based on those two components, you can identify which stories are the most valuable. And, it seems like to say, well, all human communication is storytelling is kind of simplistic. But I think when you break it down with the idea of narrative coherence and narrative fidelity, it makes sense that, yes, all human communication comes down to stories or narrative. But then the narrative paradigm recognizes that and provides a way to deduce which narratives and which stories are truly valuable. That's been the narrative paradigm. That's the theory.